As Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead said on December 31st, 1969, in a concert in San Francisco, "Looks like the 70s are going to be weird." Speaking of Watergate in Vietnam, Gerald Ford issued the statement, quote, "Our long national nightmare is over." Yet, in retrospect, most Americans associated the statement with the 70s itself. After 3 decades of steady growth, during which time median income for families doubled from $12,300 to $24,600, family income would decline after 1973 and would not regain its 1973 level again until 1986. More fundamentally, disappointment developed during the decade because it became clear that the grandiose visions of social reform and personal fulfillment so many Americans had entertained in the post-World War II period, especially in the 60s, remained out of reach. There was frustration on the left that so little had changed, and frustration on the right that so much had changed in spite of their opposition. More than anything else, the source of the division between the 60s and 70s was that in the 60s, everything seemed possible. There was unlimited economic growth, unprecedented affluence, increasing personal freedom, expanding social justice, and even the triumph over communism through victory in Vietnam. And it all seemed possible because of an active and growing federal government. It turned out that there were limits. Limits to the number of jobs, the supply of cheap oil, the purchasing power of American dollars, the reach of the American military, and the ability to remake the world. So, let's talk a little bit about some of these limits. The late 1960s were in many ways the highest the U.S. has ever been. The moon landing in 1969 was symbolic of the American century, as the publisher of Time magazine called the 20th century. Remember, we read Luce. But it turned out that there were limits. The slowing economy was visible in the annual growth rate, which is generally lower or slower for presidents in the 1980s and since then. Since the 1970s, the U.S. economy has grown, but all gains have been concentrated at the very, very top. This reverses the trend since World War II of spreading benefits to all Americans. Since 1979, we have had more and more inequality. In many ways, the U.S. is back in the 1890s in terms of the gigantic discrepancies between rich and poor. The economic demographer, Robert Moffat, has shown that, despite common misperceptions, total U.S. welfare support, that is, Social Security, food stamps, disability insurance, and so on, has not declined since the days of the Great Society. Even bracketing health expenditures, per capita government spending on means-tested programs rose pretty steadily over the last 40-plus years. What has changed, Moffat argued, is who gets help. Spending has shifted away from the jobless, single, childless, and very poor toward the elderly, the disabled, the working, married, parents, and those who are not poor. Medicaid spending, now accelerated by Obamacare, somewhat tempers this trend. Moffat's explanation is an even greater American emphasis on helping only those deemed morally deserving, the second group, the 1996 welfare reform being a prime example, which we'll talk about that next time. In practice, this malaise, as President Carter called it, was due to a series of unwelcome shocks, such as the OPEC gas embargo that led to gas rationing in 1974 and spiking oil prices ever after. Disappointment developed during the 1970s because it became clear, as I mentioned, that the grandiose visions of social reform and personal fulfillment remained out of reach. American love for space and for future was increasingly channeled into fantasy and into consumerism, not into NASA. Despite what you may think of as an age of innovation, in fact, our innovation is often today about toys and consumer gadgets rather than things the world really needs. Who really needs an iPhone? Perhaps the boldest effort was the Space Shuttle program, so called because it was intended to supply the International Space Station. Here, Americans were reaching for the stars, and yet there were limits. There was heartbreak over losing not one but 2 shuttles, so the Challenger exploded, and both shuttles were lost, and there were troubles here at home. And there are limits to U.S. power over nature. A new movement in the U.S. in the 1960s occurred. It was environmentalism. Environmentalists reacted to the costs of growth. They responded to the new science of ecology, which described a finite world. Extinction of the species as a loss of biodiversity. They picked up from conservationists who also talked about the need for long-term thinking, but environmentalists saw crisis in the present and especially the future. So, not the Soviets, but Americans' own consumer behavior was the greatest threat facing them. There were new federal rules put into place to limit and regulate the growth and protect the environment. From 1964 to 1976, the greatest wave of federal legislation in the U.S. history took place with enormously significant laws like the Wilderness Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, which creates the first new cabinet position, the EPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act. There were new rules for forests, rivers, for wilderness. But even this regulation had limits. Addiction to oil had not gone away, only increased its reach. All the laws and agencies and regulation have not prevented serious new oil spills at Prince William Sound in Alaska in 1989 or the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. In foreign policy, however, the USSR collapsed in the early 1990s, and its collapse was largely peaceful, with not a single nuclear weapon used and all accounted for. It was a great victory for everyone. It was not due to the U.S.'s outside pressure, largely, but instead to locals who overthrew their tottering, corrupt regimes on their own. But the USSR collapse did have consequences. Most of the uprisings in former Eastern European Soviet zones were peaceful, like in Germany and Poland, but neighboring areas became chaotic. The collapse of Yugoslavia, for example, the Croatia-Serbia wars, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. These were all unstable, violent areas. And we'll continue talking about what became known as globalism. As you can see, the world is getting larger. The U.S.'s place in the world is getting larger. So we'll talk about globalism and the continued interconnectedness of these different economies all over the world. And we'll also talk about terrorism as that begins to take center stage in the late decades of the 20th and the early 21st century. So if you have any questions between now and then, please feel free to send me an email.